The Greater Toronto Area is home to more than 272,000 Filipinos. The city of Cincinnati is home to somewhere between 1,100 and 2,000. That is not a small gap. That is a factor of more than 100. And Alex Eala just landed in Cincinnati. Now let me tell you what those 272,000 people did last week, because it was not subtle. They sold out a night session at Sobeys Stadium. 12,500 seats, gone. They filled it 3 separate times, because the tournament put all 3 of her singles matches in the night slot. They pushed the organizers into taking a first-round doubles match and scheduling it on center court, something the tournament director said he could not remember ever happening in the history of the event. And they made a WTA 1000 tournament change its food. The tournament director sat down with a Filipino journalist and confirmed it. They added adobo chicken to the food court. That is real leverage. That is a community that walked into a professional sport and rearranged the furniture in 7 days. Now she is in Mason, Ohio, at the Lindner Family Tennis Center, seeded 17th. The highest seeding of her career at this level, in a city where the entire Filipino population could fit inside a single restaurant. So, here is the question, and it is bigger than one tournament. If those stands look empty this week, then everything we just watched in Toronto was never a movement. It was a map. It means Alex Eala happened to play in cities that already had enormous Filipino populations. And the story writes itself when the audience is already sitting there. But if those stands fill up anyway, in a city with 1,100 Filipinos in it, then something is happening that basically does not happen in modern tennis. It means the audience travels. It means a player ranked 20th in the world, who has never won a WTA 1000 title, has an audience that gets in cars and books hotels and follows her from city to city. One of those 2 things is true. And we find out this week. What I cannot understand is why nobody in tennis is treating this as the test that it is. There is no article about it. No broadcaster is framing the week this way. Everyone is talking about her draw and her seeding, and nobody is talking about the only number that decides how this sport treats her for the next 5 years. So by the end of this video, I am going to give you the 2 specific things to watch in Cincinnati that will tell you the answer before anybody else figures it out. Not attendance totals. Something much more revealing than that. Because this week answers a question the entire tennis industry should be asking and nobody is. Is Eala Mania a movement? Or is it just a map? Here is what most people do not understand about professional tennis. Your ranking does not decide how a tournament treats you. Your box office does. In January, the Australian Open put Alex Eala on court 6. A small outside court. Thousands of Filipino fans queued for hours and got turned away at the gate, standing outside watching her on a big screen while the match happened 40 feet away behind a fence. In August, Toronto put all 3 of her singles matches in the night session, the premium slot, the most expensive tickets in the building. Her ranking barely moved between those 2 tournaments. Nothing about her tennis explains that reversal. Something else does. For anybody just finding her, here is the short version. Alex Eala is 21 years old, from Manila. At 13, she moved to Mallorca to train at the Rafa Nadal Academy, because the Philippines had no pathway and Spain did. She is now ranked 20th in the world, the first Filipino ever to reach the top 20, and she got there in the most violent way possible. At the Washington Open in early August, she beat Zheng Qinwen, an Olympic gold medalist, then Leylah Fernandez, the defending champion, then Elina Svitolina, ranked 10th, then Naomi Osaka, 4 Grand Slam titles, then Jessica Pegula, ranked 3rd in the world, in the final, coming back from a set down to win 4-6, 6-4, 6-0. 5 of those in 6 days. First WTA Tour title in the history of Philippine tennis. But the number that matters for this video is a box office number. According to Tennis 365, there is only one other player believed to have sold out a Wednesday night session in Toronto in that tournament's history. Serena Williams. That is not hype. That is the tier she is standing in commercially as a 20th ranked player who has never won a WTA 1000 event. So now you understand what is actually at stake this week, and it is not her ranking points. Tournaments talk to each other. Tournament directors compare notes. Scheduling decisions get made off ticketing data, and ticketing data from Cincinnati is going to travel around this sport within days. If the stands in Mason look thin, the conclusion will be quiet and permanent. She sells in Toronto, she sells in Manila, she sells wherever there is already a Filipino community. And everywhere else, she is a 20th ranked player who goes on court 3 at 1 in the afternoon. Night sessions gone. Center court gone. Back to being scheduled by ranking instead of by demand. And she has no control over any of it. That is the part that gets me. She just plays tennis. She said it herself in Toronto, that the atmosphere all week had been incredible, that it is hard to describe to other people what it feels like to be in a stadium full of fans and all that love, and that she will carry those memories for a really long time. That is a 21-year-old talking about being cared for. She is not thinking about ticketing reports. And here is the detail that makes this week genuinely hard, not just interesting. She is exhausted. Alex Eala has played 56 matches in 2026, more than any other player on the WTA Tour. More than Pegula. More than Rybakina. 21 tournaments in 8 months. She rolled her ankle in the second set against Katie McNally in Toronto and kept playing. 2 days later, Belinda Bencic beat her 6-4, 6-0, and she won 0 games in that second set. So the crowd this week may be asked to show up for a player who is not at her best against an opponent nobody has heard of in a suburb of Ohio on a weekday. That is the real test of a fan base. Not turning up for the coronation, turning up for the grind. If this is the kind of thing you actually want to understand about tennis, the money and the scheduling and the mechanics under the highlights, subscribe, because this channel is going to track this exact question all the way through the US Open. So the question is, what actually filled those stadiums in the first place? And the more I looked into the numbers, the less the obvious answer held up. The easy explanation is diaspora math. Toronto has 272,000 Filipinos and Toronto sold out. Melbourne has an enormous Filipino population across Australia, and thousands got turned away at the gate. 2 data points. 1 very clean theory. She plays where her people already live, her people show up, the stadium fills. If that is the whole explanation, then this week is going to be quiet and there is nothing more to discuss. But if the theory is that simple, ask yourself why nobody at the WTA seems worried about it. Cincinnati is a mandatory event for her. The tour requires top players at every WTA 1000. Nobody looked at the Ohio census and thought about moving her somewhere friendlier, because tournaments do not work that way, which means somebody somewhere is expecting demand. So let us test the theory against the rest of her season. Start with Washington. That is the tournament she won, and it is a WTA 500, not a 1000. Smaller venue, Rock Creek Park, nothing like the 12,000 seats in Toronto. And yet Jessica Pegula stood there in her runner-up speech and talked about the Filipino fans. Naomi Osaka got asked about them in a press conference. The atmosphere at a mid-sized 500 event in D.C. became a story in its own right. Then Rome. The Italian Open. Italy does not have a Filipino community anywhere near the scale of Toronto or Melbourne. And in Rome, a Filipino family did not just buy tickets for her matches. They went to her practice sessions. Philippine flags in the stands, people calling out Laban, Alex, which means fight, at a tournament in Italy. Then Dubai, where Coco Gauff played her and afterward talked about the fan base Eala was bringing into the sport. So the map theory is already leaking. Rome and Dubai are not diaspora strongholds on the scale we are talking about. Who was in those stands? And then you get to the thing in Toronto that broke the theory for me completely. Naomi Osaka finished her own match. She got into the little cart that shuttles players back through the grounds. She looked over at a practice court, and it was completely full, packed. Her first thought was to wonder who on earth was drawing that kind of crowd at a practice court. Then she saw the Philippine flags, and Eala had not even walked on yet. Sit with that for a second, because a practice court is where every commercial explanation dies. Nobody sells tickets to a practice court. There is no night session. There is no premium pricing. There is no broadcast, no scoreboard, no result, nothing to buy, and nothing to win. The tournament cannot manufacture that crowd, and it cannot monetize it either. Nobody sells tickets to a practice court. So what were all those people paying for? Because if the answer is just diaspora density, the practice court should be empty. Diaspora density explains why locals buy tickets to a match. It does not explain why hundreds of people stand around a chain-link fence for an hour to watch a warm-up. Now here is where the whole thing gets genuinely bleak, and I want to walk through it honestly instead of pretending I have good news. You might be thinking, fine, the fans will just drive in, that is the obvious fix. Ohio has nearly 17,000 Filipino Americans, and the Midwest has more. Look at the actual logistics of this week. The tournament is in Mason, Ohio. That is a suburb, about half an hour outside Cincinnati proper. Not a downtown arena you can walk to after work. Eala got a first-round bye as the 17th seed, which means she starts in the round of 64. Her match is expected around Friday, a weekday. Her opponent is the winner of Magda Lynette against Elena Gabriela Ruse. Lynette is ranked 68th. Ruse is 77th. With enormous respect to both of them, neither of those names sells a single ticket in Ohio. Nobody in Columbus is taking a personal day for Ruse, so price this out from a fan's perspective. You live 2 hours away. It is a Friday. You need to take time off work, drive to a suburb, pay WTA 1,000 ticket prices to watch a tired 21-year-old with a bad ankle play the 68th ranked player in the world. How many people do that? And if the answer is not many, the damage is not just one quiet afternoon. The damage is that 9 months of leverage gets logged as a question mark. Every tournament director who is about to plan around her sees the Cincinnati numbers and decides to wait and see instead. The night sessions stop being automatic. Toronto becomes the outlier instead of the template. She cannot fix it by playing well because she plays after the tickets are sold. The fans cannot fix it because there are 1,100 of them in that city. And the tournament cannot fix it because you cannot conjure an audience out of a census. So I went looking for the thing that actually explains those crowds, and I found it in the least likely place. Not in a stadium, in a food court. And in one sentence, Eala said about a concert. After she beat Katie McNally in Toronto, Eala repeated something a fan had shouted at her that night. Somebody in that crowd told her they wanted to be Filipino for the night. And her answer to that is, I think, the single most important thing anybody has said about this entire phenomenon. She said she went to a Bad Bunny concert once, and she felt Puerto Rican for that night. Stop. That is the mechanism. A 21-year-old tennis player explained her own audience better than any analyst has, in 2 sentences, without trying. Because here is what I had wrong, and what the headline of this video has wrong, and what everybody talking about Ohio census data has wrong. An Alex Eala match is not a sporting event that you attend. It is a concert. And concerts do not run on local population density. How many Puerto Ricans live in Cincinnati? Nobody asks that question before Bad Bunny sells the place out. Nobody stands in a marketing meeting pulling up census tables for a Bad Bunny date in Ohio, because that is not how a concert audience works. A concert audience is not local. It is devoted, and devotion moves. Now put those 2 audience types side by side, because they behave in completely different ways. A sports audience buys tickets based on the quality of the matchup. They look at the draw. They see Lynette or Ruse, and they stay home. They are consumers evaluating a product, and Friday afternoon against the 68th ranked player is a bad product. A concert audience buys tickets based on the artist. They do not care who is opening. They drive 4 hours. They book a hotel. They wear the same colors as everybody else in the building. They arrive early. And here is the part that finally clicked for me. They go to the sound check, which, in tennis, is the practice court. That is why the practice court in Toronto was packed before she walked on. That was never a tennis crowd. Tennis crowds do not do that. That was a concert crowd showing up for sound check, and once you see it that way, the whole thing stops being confusing and starts being obvious. It also explains Rome. It explains Dubai. It explains a WTA 500 inches Washington becoming a story. Those rooms were not filled by locals who happened to live nearby. They were filled by people who traveled, plus a second group that almost nobody is counting. And that second group is the real answer to Cincinnati: non-Filipinos. This is the part of the story that gets left out of every article, and Eala said it herself. Talking about Toronto, she described what she had actually seen in that stadium, a city that was passionate and multicultural, where Filipino supporters and Turkish fans and local Canadian fans all turned out for players they saw themselves in, and where tennis pulled different communities into the same building. She was not describing a Filipino crowd. She was describing a crowd that a Filipino crowd started. Think about what it is like to sit in the loudest, happiest, most alive section of a professional tennis tournament. People who have no connection to the Philippines watch that on TikTok and they do not think about heritage. They think, I want to be in that room. So the formula was never how many Filipinos live in this city. The formula is how many people want to be in the most fun room at the tournament. And that number is not printed in any census, which is exactly why nobody in tennis can forecast it, and exactly why the number in this video's title is close to meaningless. 1100 was never the relevant figure. We have all been counting the wrong kind of person for 10 minutes. Now, I want to be careful, because I am not here to sell you certainty. This does not guarantee that Cincinnati fills up. It is a suburb, it is a Friday, and enthusiasm is not the same as attendance. A concert audience still has to be able to physically get there. What it does mean is that if those stands do fill, it will not be a miracle and it will not be a fluke. It will be the same machine that filled Toronto, just running without the home crowd advantage. And that would be the more impressive version of the story, not the lesser one. So before we go into the evidence, I want to hear from you on this specific point, because it is the argument I keep having with myself. Is a fan base that behaves like a concert crowd better for tennis than a traditional one, or does the sport eventually push back against it? Roddick has already had to tell people to be quiet about the noise. Tell me where you land in the comments, because this is the fault line the sport is going to be arguing about for in the next decade, and I would rather hear it from you than from a broadcaster. Because once you see it as a concert instead of a tennis match, every number that did not add up starts adding up. There are 3 of them I want to show you. And the third one is the reason Cincinnati might actually end up bigger than Toronto. Proof number 1. And it is my favorite statistic of the entire season. After Washington, a podcast hosted by Jessica Pegula and Madison Keys gained more than 10,000 new subscribers. Not Eala's channel. The channel of the woman she beat in the final. Eala had been a guest on that podcast at some point earlier. That is the entire connection. And 10,000 people went and subscribed to 2 American players because of it. Now tell me which diaspora model predicts that. There is no version of population density that produces that number. But a concert audience does exactly that. They do not just buy the ticket, they go stream the opening act. They follow the tour bus. They get invested in the whole production, not just the headliner. That is a fandom behavior, not a geography behavior. Proof number 2 comes from someone who lost. Katie McNally played Eala in Toronto and lost in 3 sets, 6-3, 5-7, 6-4. A match she genuinely could have won, in front of roughly 10,000 people who were all cheering against her. And she came out of it calling the atmosphere incredible. Then Eala repeated what McNally said to her at the net. McNally congratulated her, and then said, "Thanks for letting me be a part of this. Thanks for letting me be a part of this." Professional athletes do not say that after a loss. They say, "I will be back," I learned a lot. My time is coming. Nobody thanks the winner for being included, unless she understood she had just played inside something that was not really a third-round tennis match. She had played inside an event, and she could tell, from the wrong side of the net, that being in that building was worth something. Now, proof number 3, and this is the one that changes the math for Ohio. Cincinnati is not a standalone stop. It is the second half of a 2-week campaign, and the finale is in New York. On August 27th, 3 days before the U.S. Open begins, Alex Eala is scheduled to play an exhibition match at Arthur Ashe Stadium against her American friend Eva Jovic as part of a USTA Foundation charity event. Arthur Ashe holds 23,000 people. It is the largest tennis stadium on Earth. So this is not one tournament in a suburb. This is a tour with a stadium show at the end of it, and Ohio is on the route, which is exactly how a concert audience thinks about a Tuesday date in a secondary market. You go because the tour is passing through, not because the local scene is strong. And now the geography actually helps instead of hurting. The city of Cincinnati has 1,100 to 2,000 Filipinos, but the state of Ohio has nearly 17,000 Filipino Americans. Add a driving radius. Columbus, Indianapolis, Louisville, Lexington, Detroit, Chicago. Every one of those is a day trip or an overnight for somebody who is willing, and we have already established that this audience is willing because they show up to practice courts. So we are back at the question from the top of this video, and now we can answer it properly. The 1100 number was never the number to watch. It was the number that makes a good headline. 1100 is a city limit. 17,000 is a state. And a 6-hour driving radius in the Midwest is neither of those things. Which brings me to the part I actually want to give you, because I do not want you taking my word for any of this. I want you to be able to check it yourself. Live. This week. Do not watch the attendance figure. Attendance figures at WTA 1000 events are muddy. They include grounds, passes, and they get spun. Watch 2 things instead. Number 1. Watch whether Cincinnati puts her in the night session. That is the only honest signal a tournament ever gives you, because the night session is where the money is. A tournament that believes in your box office puts you there, and a tournament that does not. Toronto did it 3 times in a row. If Cincinnati does the same thing after seeing Toronto's ticketing data, that is a tournament placing a bet on her, in public, with its most valuable inventory. Number 2. And this is the purer signal. Watch her practice court. Nobody sells a ticket to a practice session. It cannot be marketed, it cannot be inflated, it cannot be monetized. If a practice court in Mason, Ohio is 3 or 4 people deep along the fence, then this audience travels, and there is no commercial explanation available. That is devotion showing up on camera with no ticket stub attached. And here is the small detail that gives us extra data. Because she is seeded 17th, she got a first-round bye. She is in Mason a full extra day before she competes. That is 1 more day for word to spread locally, and 1 more practice session to count heads at. So we have the wrong number in the headline, the right numbers to watch, and about 4 days to find out. Which leaves the only question that actually matters, and it is not about Cincinnati at all. So here is the answer. Cincinnati does not have a Filipino population problem. Cincinnati has an opportunity. 1,100 is a city limit. 17,000 is a state. And a 6-hour driving radius in the Midwest is neither of those things. If those stands fill up in a place where the map says they should not, then Eala Mania stops being a diaspora story permanently. It becomes a traveling fan base, and tournaments will have to start planning around her instead of reacting to her. And that is the argument Filipino writers have already been making. The smart tournaments will not wait for demand to spike and then scramble to move her to a bigger court. They will prepare in advance. Community outreach, merchandise that actually makes sense, food partnerships, fan activations, scheduling built around the audience she brings with her. They gave the phenomenon a name. They call it the Eala caravan. A caravan does not need a local population. That is the whole point of a caravan. Here is the route from here. Cincinnati this week. Arthur Ashe on August 27th. The U.S. Open on August 30th in New York, home to the largest Filipino population in the United States and a short train ride from Flushing Meadows. Then Singapore in September. Then Wuhan and Beijing in Asia, where the population question stops being a question at all. But I want to leave you with a thing I actually cannot stop thinking about, and it is not whether Ohio shows up, it is what happens in the first city that does not, because that day is coming. Somewhere, in some week, she will be exhausted, and her opponent will be ranked 77th, and it will rain, and the stands will look thin on television. That is not pessimism, that is just a long season, and that is the day we find out what this really is. A movement survives a bad Tuesday. A trend does not. I do not know which one this is yet. Nobody does. Not the WTA, not the tournament directors, not Andy Roddick. So here is what I am asking you to do this week, and it is genuinely useful, not a formality. Watch those two things. Whether they put her in the night session in Cincinnati, and how many people show up to a practice court that costs nothing to attend. Then come back here and tell me what you saw, because I am tracking both of them, and I would rather have 20 pairs of eyes on it than one. And if you are Filipino and you are anywhere within driving distance of Mason, Ohio this week, you already know what I am about to say. You are not a spectator in this story. You are the variable. Subscribe so you get the follow-up, because Cincinnati is 4 days of data, and New York is right behind it. I will see you when we know.